All right, so you sent over a whole stack of executive orders about gender identity and sexual orientation.
Yeah.
Looks like you're really interested in digging deep into this topic that's both complex and always changing.
Hmm.
We've got a timeline here of EOs starting in 2021 and running all the way to today, February 23rd, 2025.
Okay.
And let me tell you, things have taken some pretty dramatic turns over those years.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how much the legal landscape has
All
shifted
right.
in such a short period.
Absolutely. So in this deep dive, we're going to break down these executive orders
Okay.
and help you understand how they've tried to reshape the rules around gender identity and sexual orientation.
Hmm.
We'll be focusing on the real-world impacts,
Right.
how these changes have affected things like education, healthcare, and even the military.
We're going to start by setting the stage back in 2021 during the Biden administration.
Okay.
They really kicked things off with a series of executive orders that aim to protect and expand the rights of LGBTQI plus individuals.
Right. It seems like Biden came in swinging, making
Yeah.
it clear that this was a priority for his administration.
Hmm.
The first one, EO 13988, signed in January of 2021, was like a mission statement.
Yeah.
It basically said, we're going to prevent and combat discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation across all areas of the federal government.
And this was huge EE.
Right.
We're not just talking about employment within the federal government.
Mhm.
This EO covered everything from housing and healthcare to education.
Wow.
It was Biden's attempt to ensure equal treatment for LGBTQI plus individuals across the board, setting the stage for a pretty significant shift in federal policy.
So Biden lays down this broad mandate for equality.
Right.
Then just a week later, he signs EO 14004,
Okay.
which reversed that Trump-era ban on transgender people serving in the military.
Mm-hmm.
Was this a direct response to pushback against the ban, or was it already part of Biden's plan?
It was definitely a key campaign promise.
Okay.
And it reflects the growing consensus among military leaders that the ban was unnecessary and potentially harmful to military readiness.
Interesting.
Biden actually cited a 2016 Department of Defense study that showed minimal impact on readiness and healthcare costs associated with transgender service members.
He didn't stop there, did he? He actually brought up testimony from military leaders who said that having transgender individuals serving hadn't caused any issues with unit cohesion or morale, right?
That's exactly right.
Wow.
He used those firsthand accounts to directly counter the arguments that had been used to justify the ban in the first place.
Okay.
It was a strategic move to emphasize that the concerns about unit cohesion were largely unfounded.
So in the span of just a few weeks, Biden tackles discrimination in all areas of federal activity. A&D reverses the ban on transgender service members.
Mhm.
It sounds like he was really building momentum on LGBTQI plus rights.
Yeah.
Then a couple of months later, in March of 2021, he signs EO 14021, and this one's all about education.
EO 1-21 was incredibly important because it sought to guarantee a safe and inclusive learning environment for all students.
Okay.
It specifically addressed the issue of sex-based harassment and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in schools.
It's interesting because it feels like we're moving from these broad, sweeping statements about equality
Right.
to a more focused approach, tackling specific areas where discrimination was happening.
Mm.
And EO 12021 also called for a review of the Trump administration's Title IX regulations, which govern how schools handle sexual harassment and assault cases, right?
Right. You got it.
Okay.
Title Act has a huge impact on how schools and colleges operate, and any changes to those regulations could potentially have a ripple effect across the entire educational system.
Fast forward to June 2022, and we
Yeah.
get EO 147.5.
Okay.
This one almost feels like Biden's taking stock of the progress so far
Mm.
and saying, okay, we've laid out the big picture, but now let's get down to the nitty-gritty of how to make real change.
That's a great way to put it. EO 14075 went beyond just stating a commitment to equality
Okay.
and started tackling the real-world barriers that LGBTQI plus people face in areas like healthcare and child welfare.
Mhm.
For example, it called for action to address harmful state-level legislation targeting LGBTQI plus individuals
Oh, okay.
and address the dangers of conversion therapy, a practice that's been widely discredited.
It seems like with EO 140075, the Biden administration was trying to move beyond just words and really address the systemic issues that were preventing LGBTQI plus individuals from achieving true equality.
Exactly. They recognized that equality wasn't just about passing laws, but
Right.
about creating real change in the lives of people across the country.
Okay.
So they focused on concrete issues like lack of access to comprehensive health care, including mental and reproductive health,
Mm-hmm.
and discrimination in child welfare and juvenile justice systems.
So for a few years there, it seemed like the needle was really moving on LGBTQI plus rights. But then in 2025, we see a complete shift in direction, with a new administration taking a very different approach.
Right.
Right?
The inauguration of a new president in January 2025 led to a wave of policy reversals,
Right.
with the new administration arguing that the previous policies were rooted in gender ideology, which they viewed as a harmful and unscientific concept.
And their very first move was to sign EO 44168,
Hmm.
which seems to be all about pushing back against the idea that gender identity is separate from biological sex.
EO 44168 was a major turning point.
Okay.
It aimed to restore biological truth to the federal government
Mm-hmm.
by defining sex solely as an individual's immutable biological classification as either male or female, explicitly excluding gender identity.
So how did this new definition of sex actually play out in terms of federal policy?
Well, it had some pretty significant implications.
Okay.
The EO directed all federal agencies to revise their policies,
Right.
forms, and
Mhm.
even communications to reflect this new, more narrow definition of sex.
Wow, that's a good deal. It sounds like they were trying to roll back many of the protections that had been put in place under the Biden administration.
Mm-hmm.
And this was just the beginning of a series of EOs that sought to restrict LGBTQI plus rights.
Exactly. EO 4P168 really laid the groundwork for what was to come.
And just a week later, they doubled down with EO 44187,
Mhm.
which specifically targets medical interventions for transgender youth.
This one was particularly controversial.
Mm-hmm.
It labeled these medical interventions,
Right.
which are often recommended by healthcare professionals, as chemical and surgical mutilation.
That's strong language. And what actions did EO 44187 actually take against these medical interventions?
It called for an end to federal funding for such interventions
Okay.
and directed agencies to explore ways to restrict access to them through insurance coverage and other means.
It sounds like they were really trying to make it difficult,
Yeah.
if not impossible, for
Mhm.
transgender youth to access the healthcare they needed.
Unfortunately, that seems to be the case. And they even went so far as to target the World Professional Association for Transgender Health,
Right.
or WPPATH,
Mm-hmm.
which is a respected organization that provides guidance on transgender health care.
Okay.
The EO claimed that their guidance lacks scientific integrity,
Oh.
which many medical professionals disputed.
So in a very short period, we see this complete 180 on LGBTQI plus rights.
Yeah.
What started as a push for equality and inclusion quickly turned into a fight to restrict those rights
Right.
and to control the narrative around gender identity.
You hit the nail on the head.
Okay.
The ideological differences between these two administrations are stark,
Right.
and the impact on the lives of LGBTQI plus individuals, especially young people,
Right.
is undeniable.
Yeah. It's almost like we're looking at two completely different realities when you compare those two sets of executive orders.
Right. I mean, on one hand, you have this push for expanding rights and protections.
And then on the other, you have this effort to narrow the very definition of gender and roll back those hard-won gains.
And that really gets to the heart of the tension we're seeing play out.
Right.
Is it simply a matter of biological truth, as the new administration claims?
Right.
Or is it something more? Is there an ideological agenda driving these policy shifts?
And to me, that's what makes this whole conversation so fascinating and, frankly, a little scary.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about abstract legal concepts, it's
Yeah.
about how we define ourselves and how those definitions impact our ability to live full and authentic lives.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
We're talking about real people's lives, their access to health care, their right to education,
Right.
even their sense of safety and belonging.
Like we saw with EFO 44187, which targeted medical interventions for transgender youth.
Yeah.
That wasn't just a policy change.
Right.
That had real-world consequences for young people who are already facing so many challenges.
Absolutely. And the language used in these EOs, chemical and surgical mutilation,
Right.
is so loaded and inflammatory. It's clearly designed to evoke a negative emotional response and to frame these interventions as inherently harmful.
That's strong language.
Yeah.
And it almost feels like they're trying to control the narrative to shape how people perceive these issues,
Right.
even if it means ignoring scientific evidence or the lived experiences of transgender individuals.
And that's what makes staying informed so important.
Right.
We can't just passively accept these narratives without questioning them.
Okay.
We need to look at the evidence, listen to the voices of those who are directly impacted,
Right.
and make our own informed decisions.
And that's not always easy, especially in today's media landscape where misinformation spreads so quickly.
Right.
I feel like everyone has an agenda, and it's hard to know who to trust.
You're telling me.
Yeah.
It's exhausting.
Yeah.
But that's where critical thinking comes in. We need to be able to evaluate information critically, to separate fact from opinion,
Right.
and to be wary of sources that are pushing a particular ideology without acknowledging other perspectives.
So we've got these executive orders that are essentially trying to redefine gender and restrict LGBTQI plus rights.
Right.
But we're also seeing pushback in the courts, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Lots of legal challenges to these EOs are popping up all over the place.
Many of these executive orders are already facing legal challenges.
Okay.
And this is where things get really interesting because it's up to the courts to interpret these laws
Right.
and decide whether they violate existing constitutional protections.
So we could potentially see some of these EOs overturned or at least significantly modified depending on how the courts rule.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's going to be fascinating to see how this all plays out.
Right.
Because we're dealing with some pretty fundamental legal questions here
Right.
about the scope of executive power, the limits of federal authority,
Right.
and the balance between individual rights and government interests.
And all of this is happening against the backdrop of this incredibly polarized political climate and this increasingly heated cultural debate about gender identity and LGBTQI plus rights.
It's almost like we're living through a major social and cultural shift.
Right.
And these executive orders are both a reflection of that shift and a catalyst for even more change.
It's a lot to process, honestly. I
Yeah.
mean, where do we even begin to make sense of it all?
Right.
What advice would you give to someone who's trying to navigate this complex and ever-changing landscape?
Well, first of all, I'd say don't
Yeah.
panic.
Okay.
It's easy to get overwhelmed by all of this,
Right.
but it's important to remember that these issues have been debated for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And there are resources available to help you understand the different perspectives and arguments.
So start by educating yourself. Do your research,
Yeah.
but also be mindful of the sources you're consulting.
Exactly. Look for sources that are credible.
Objective, and present a balanced view of the issues.
Okay.
And don't be afraid to ask questions,
Right.
to challenge assumptions, and to form your own opinions based on the evidence.
Because ultimately, this isn't just a legal or political debate.
Right.
It's about people's lives, their identities,
Yeah.
and their right to live authentically.
And we all have a role to play in shaping this conversation and advocating for a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture.
Yeah.
The sweeping policy changes, the ideological battles,
Right.
the legal challenges.
Yeah.
But I want to bring it back down to earth for a second.
Okay, let's do it. What are you thinking?
Well, I'm thinking about the average person who's hearing all of this
Yeah.
and wondering how it actually impacts their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what does all of this mean for someone who's just trying to live their life,
Right.
go to work, raise their family?
That's a great question.
I think it's important to remember that these executive orders, while impactful,
Right.
don't operate in a vacuum.
Okay.
They're part of a larger system of laws,
Right.
policies, and social norms that shape our lives in countless ways.
So even though they're federal directives,
Right.
their impact can vary depending on where you live, your
Yeah.
job,
Yeah.
your family situation, and so many other factors.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to not only understand the federal landscape, but also to be aware of the laws and policies in your own state and local community,
Oh.
because that's where you're going to see the most direct impact on your day-to-day life.
So, for example, if you're a parent of a transgender child, the availability of gender-affirming health care might depend on the state you live in,
Right.
regardless of what the federal government says.
That's a great example.
Okay.
Or if you're a transgender individual who's looking for a job,
Right.
you might face discrimination in some states that have weaker anti-discrimination laws.
Okay.
Even though federal law prohibits discrimination based on gender identity in employment.
And let's not forget about the impact on education.
Hmm.
We've seen states passing laws that restrict the rights of transgender students to use bathrooms or locker rooms that align with their gender identity,
Right.
or that ban transgender athletes from competing in sports consistent with their gender identity.
It's a really complex and constantly evolving landscape,
Yeah,
and it can be hard to keep up with all the changes.
right.
But the key takeaway is that these issues are playing out at multiple levels, federal, state,
Right.
and local.
Okay.
And it's important to be aware of what's happening in your own community.
So it's not enough to just follow the news at the national level.
Right.
You really need to dig into what's happening in your own backyard
Yeah.
to understand how these policies are being implemented and enforced.
And that's where local advocacy and activism becomes so crucial.
Mhm.
Because ultimately, change often starts at the grassroots level.
Mm,
By getting involved in your community,
right?
you can help shape the conversation and advocate for policies that protect and support LGBTQI plus individuals.
It's empowering to think that we don't have to just sit back and passively accept these policy changes.
Right.
We can actually make a difference by engaging in our own communities and holding our elected officials accountable.
Absolutely.
Right.
And even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Right.
By speaking out against discrimination,
Mm-hmm.
supporting LGBTQI plus organizations,
All right.
and educating others about these issues, we can create a more inclusive and equitable society for everyone.
So we've covered a lot of ground here,
Mm.
and it can feel overwhelming.
Yeah.
But the key takeaway is that we're not alone in this.
Right.
There are resources available, organizations fighting for change,
Yeah.
and communities coming together to support each other.
And by staying informed,
Right.
engaging in thoughtful discussions,
Mm-hmm.
and taking action at whatever level we're comfortable with, we can all contribute to creating a more just and equitable world.
Okay, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier about the importance of evidence-based policymaking.
Right. That's something I feel very strongly about.
Because it seems like in all the back and forth about gender identity and LGBTQI plus rights,
Yeah.
we often lose sight of the facts.
And that's dangerous. We can't just let ideology and personal beliefs dictate policy decisions.
Right.
We need to base our policies on sound scientific evidence and data.
And we saw how some of these executive orders specifically targeted certain research organizations or studies,
Right.
claiming they lacked scientific integrity.
And that's incredibly concerning
Yeah.
because it undermines the whole process of scientific inquiry
Mm.
and erodes public trust in scientific institutions.
Right.
We need to be able to rely on experts in their fields to provide accurate and unbiased information.
But it also feels like we're living in a time where people are increasingly skeptical of experts and institutions.
That's true, and I think part of that stems from the fact that we're bombarded with so much information
Right.
from so many different sources.
Mm-hmm.
It can be hard to discern what's credible and what's not.
So how do we combat that? How do we promote scientific literacy and encourage people to think critically about the information they're consuming?
Well, I think education is key.
Okay.
We need to start teaching critical thinking skills at a young age to help people develop the ability to evaluate information,
Right.
identify biases,
Mm-hmm.
and spot misinformation.
And we also need to make sure that scientific research is accessible to the public.
Absolutely. We need to break down the jargon,
Right.
translate complex findings into plain language,
Mm-hmm.
and make it easier for people to understand and engage with scientific research.
And we need to support and defend the institutions that are doing this important work.
Right.
The universities, the research labs, scientific journals.
Yeah.
These institutions are vital for advancing knowledge and informing policy decisions. We need to protect their independence and ensure that they're free from political interference.
Yeah. It's almost like we need a cultural shift
Right.
where we value evidence and critical thinking over ideology and blind faith.
I couldn't agree more.
Right.
We need to create a society where people are encouraged to ask questions, to challenge assumptions,
Yeah.
and to base their beliefs on evidence rather than just what they hear or read.
And that's a tall order.
Right.
But I think it's essential if we want to make progress on these complex and challenging issues.
It's definitely a long-term goal, but I think it's achievable if we all do our part to promote scientific literacy and critical thinking.
Yeah, it really is. It's amazing to see how interconnected this all is. The decisions made here in the U.S. can have a real impact on the lives of LGBTQI plus people across the globe. It's a powerful reminder that we're all part of a global community and that the fight for human rights knows no borders.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
Yeah.
We've explored the evolution of executive orders related to gender identity and sexual orientation,
Mm-hmm.
the legal battles they've sparked,
Right.
and the personal impact they've had on individuals and families.
Absolutely.
We've delved into the complexities of scientific research and the importance of evidence-based policymaking. And we've even touched on the global context of the LGBTQI plus rights movement.
Right.
I feel like my brain is bursting with new information,
Yeah.
but in a good way.
Good.
What are some of the key takeaways you want our listener to walk away with?
Well, first and foremost, I hope they understand that this is an incredibly complex and nuanced issue.
Right.
There are no easy answers,
Mm.
and there are valid arguments to be made on all sides.
It's not about being right or wrong,
Right.
but about engaging in thoughtful and respectful dialogue,
Mhm.
even when we disagree.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I hope our listener feels empowered to continue their own exploration of these issues,
Okay.
to seek out diverse perspectives,
Right.
and to challenge their own assumptions.
Because ultimately, this is a conversation that affects us all, regardless of our own sexual orientation or gender identity.
It's about creating a society that is just and equitable for everyone.
Right.
A society where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued for who they are.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier.
Okay.
The potential long-term impacts of these executive orders and policy shifts.
Ah, yes. The crystal ball question.
Right.
It's always tricky to predict the future, especially in such a rapidly evolving area of law and policy.
But it's worth considering, right?
Oh, absolutely.
What are some of the potential ripple effects we might see in the years to come?
Well, one thing that's almost certain is that the legal battles are far from over.
Okay.
We can expect to see continued challenges to these executive orders,
Mm.
both at the state and federal levels.
And the outcomes of those legal challenges could have a profound impact on the lives of LGBTQI plus individuals and families.
Absolutely. A court ruling in favor of one side or the other could set a precedent that shapes the legal landscape for years to come.
And beyond the legal arena,
Mm-hmm.
there's also the question of how these policy shifts will affect the social and cultural climate.
Right. Will we see an increase in discrimination or violence against LGBTQI plus individuals?
Right.
Will these policies embolden those who hold anti-LGBTQI plus views? These are questions we can't answer with certainty,
Right.
but they're certainly worth pondering.
And it's important to remember that these policy changes are happening against a backdrop of increasing political polarization and social division.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
The political climate can have a huge impact on how these issues are debated and how policies are implemented.
So it's not just about the laws themselves,
Right.
but about the broader context in which they're being enacted.
Exactly. We need to be aware of the political forces at play
Yeah.
and how they're shaping the conversation around LGBTQI plus rights.
Okay, so we've got legal uncertainty,
Mm-hmm.
potential social and cultural ramifications,
Right.
and a polarized political climate.
Yeah.
Anything else we need to add to the potential impacts list?
Well, I think it's also important to consider the impact on public health,
Okay.
particularly for transgender individuals.
Right. We talked about how some of these executive orders sought to restrict access to gender-affirming healthcare,
Yeah.
especially for transgender youth.
And that could have serious consequences for the physical and mental health of transgender individuals.
Denying access to necessary healthcare can lead to all sorts of problems, from delayed diagnoses to untreated conditions to
Lots of-
increased stress and anxiety.
And it could also make it harder for transgender individuals to live full and authentic lives.
So the stakes are really high here.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about abstract legal concepts. We're talking about people's lives, their well-being,
Mm-hmm.
their fundamental rights.
And that's why it's so important to stay informed,
Right.
to engage in these conversations,
Yeah.
and to advocate for policies that protect and support LGBTQI plus individuals.
Okay. I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
We've covered so much ground,
Yeah.
and I hope our listener feels more informed and empowered to navigate this complex and ever-changing landscape.
Me too. And I just want to reiterate that we're here to support our listener in their journey.
Okay.
If they have any questions, want to explore specific topics further,
Right.
or just need someone to talk to, we're always available.
And as we leave you to ponder all that we've discussed, we'd like to leave you with one final provocative thought.
Okay?
These executive orders raise a fundamental question about the role of government in our lives.
Mhm.
Where do we draw the line between individual freedom and government authority? Who gets to define our identities? And how much control should the government have over our personal decisions?
Mm-hmm.
These are questions that will continue to be debated for years to come, and we encourage you to engage in those debates thoughtfully and respectfully.
And remember, your voice matters.
Right.
By speaking out, sharing your story, and advocating for change, you can make a difference in the lives of LGBTQI plus individuals and help create a more just and equitable world for all.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.